Joseph Smith was living in the Whitney store when on Christmas Day, 1832, he received one of the most chilling prophecies he'd ever received in his prophetic career. He wrote down this prophecy, which has commonly become known as the Prophecy on War, and today is section 87 of the Doctrine and Covenants. The prophecy talked about a war that would break out in the United States. This wasn't his first warning. He was given section 45 of the Doctrine and Covenants a few years earlier that said, "Ye hear of wars in distant lands, but it is at your door, that time will come when there will be wars in your own lands." The prophecy that Joseph Smith received spoke of the northern states being aligned against the southern states, and that the war would start in South Carolina. Now, at the time, South Carolina was in consternation with the rest of the United States. They had started to nullify laws that they didn't like, which caused the president at the time, who was Andrew Jackson, to threaten them with invasion if they didn't step back into line. But Joseph's prophecy continued past a war between the north and the southern states to talk about the southern states calling upon other nations and then war being poured out upon all nations. It said that slaves would rise up against their masters and after many days be marshaled and prepared for war. And then it spoke of war being poured out upon all nations and advised the saints to stand in holy places lest they be caught unawares. Now, that's not a great Christmas present. And Joseph Smith and his associates were understandably disturbed by what they had received. So a few days later, they inquired of the Lord and they received another revelation. This revelation is section 88, the revelation on peace. Several revelations received over several days. So just to contrast, the revelation on war is 8 verses long. The revelation on peace is 141 verses long. Joseph Smith sealed up section 88 and called it the olive leaf plucked from the tree of paradise and the Lord's message of peace to us. So there's more good than bad in the prophecies of Joseph Smith. There's more things to look forward to than there are things to dread. But it might be time for us to take a few minutes and talk about war and peace in the Doctrine and Covenants and what we have to look forward to and what we might need to be careful about as we get closer and closer to the time of the Savior's second coming. My name is Casey Griffiths, and I love learning about church history. Join me as we travel the world and explore the history of the Latter-day Saints. This is Restoration Revealed. A few hours away from Gettysburg, near Philadelphia, is the World War II battleship USS New Jersey. And this might be part of the prophecy as well. You see, the prophecy talks about a civil war in America, but might go beyond that. For instance, it says the southern states will be aligned against the northern states, and the southern states will call upon other nations, even the nation of Great Britain, and they shall call upon other nations, and war shall be poured out upon all nations. Now, some people think that the they is the southern states, and some people think that the they is Great Britain, meaning this isn't just a prophecy about the American Civil War. This is a prophecy of all the wars leading up to the second coming of Jesus Christ. That would mean that this amazing, beautiful World War II ship is part of the story as well of the wars leading up to the second coming of Christ. And to be here, you can get a feel for the perils that existed in the latter days, and the heroics and the failures, the good and the evil are all part of the story of how we're creating the new world that Christ will bring. So take this, Philadelphia. So come with me as I meet up with my good friend Jared Riddick, a Civil War enthusiast, at Gettysburg to discuss the historical context surrounding the Civil War. So one unique thing about the American Civil War is it's fratricidal. It's brother against brother.
Very much so, very much so. And nowhere do I think on the battlefield is that exemplified best than by this, the Maryland Monument. More than 3,000 Marylanders fought on both sides during the Civil War. This monument depicts a U.S. soldier from Maryland and a Confederate soldier from Maryland.
And both here at Gettysburg, you could have someone from the same state fighting someone else from the exact same state.
Exactly. Yeah, 3,000 fought here, and I love that this monument says, brothers again, Marylanders all. This country, I would say, was stronger after the Civil War as a result of the Civil War than it was beforehand. That took a while, but we got there.
And we're still working on it in some ways.
Yeah.
Section 87 says that the wars, plural, will commence beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina.
It does. Actually, let's go the actual verse just so we have it. Verily thus saith the Lord concerning the wars that will shortly come to pass. Yeah, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina, which will eventually terminate in the death and misery of many souls. And South Carolina was where they were going to lay Fort Sumter under siege and fire upon it. The federal troops there wouldn't be able to hold out for very long, and that was what kicked off the war.
So this prophecy is given in 1832, 28 years before Fort Sumter.
Yeah.
How likely was it that South Carolina would be the start of the rebellion back then? Like, could Joseph Smith have predicted this?
You would have the argument because the nullification crisis was in the middle of happening on Christmas Day, 1832, when Joseph made that prophecy. That was when South Carolina was starting to nullify federal law, specifically trade tariffs that were disadvantaging towards them. And they weren't happy about it. They were ready to back out of the Union as a result. They had a couple other southern governments that might have been willing to back them up, but you weren't going to have Great Britain stepping in to intervene like Joseph is prophesying in Section 87. That's a total difference between 1832 and the beginning of the Civil War.
Okay. And then Joseph Smith actually repeats this in 1843.
He does.
He says it's going to start at South Carolina, and he even says it'll probably arise over the slave question. He's not talking about tariffs.
He gives us that detail that he was doing it when he was earnestly engaged in prayer, which we kind of don't get in the beginning of Section 87. There's not really a reason for him to reinforce that in 1843. And it was a reinforcement of a prophecy. People say that Joseph hushed this prophecy up because it didn't come to pass. But yeah, if that's the case, there's no reason for him to repeat it 11 years later.
Yeah. So this is the beginning of the war.
This is the beginning.
Let's go see some other places that talk about, other facets of the war.
All right, let's go. Wow. Nice view. It is. This observation tower gives one of the best ones on the battlefield.
And you made it up there with, you're not even breathing hard.
No, not at all.
You must be in excellent shape.
Yes.
This is Gettysburg.
This is Gettysburg.
And how does this fit into the Civil War, the war between the southern states and the northern states?
Gettysburg is often referred to as the turning point in the Civil War. The North had struggled before this point. It had a lot of commanders. It had a lot of losses in the battlefield. But here, they're fighting on their own soil. The Confederacy has invaded. Again, they tried once the year before, but they are here in Pennsylvania, and the Northerners are fighting on their own soil to defend it from a Confederate invasion.
Yeah, this is the biggest battle of the war. How many people are we talking? What are the casualties like?
You're looking at the casualty numbers are about 50,000 is what the number generally is given.
That's both sides combined?
Both sides combined. You're looking at about 80 to 100,000 by the third day on the Union side, and Lee's army is about 70,000.
Okay.
So this is a town of 2,500 people.
So out of that many people, 50,000
killed, wounded, or missing.
Wow.
It is exceptional. And when you think about when the armies leave, this town of 2,500 is left with 10 times that at least to bury and treat and care for. That's why there's a national cemetery at Gettysburg. You don't get that at all battlefields. Well, from here, let's actually head down, and we'll go into the battlefield itself, and we'll check out some of these places, and you can see what it felt like on the ground.
On the ground eye level of what the battle's like.
Yep, for the soldiers there.
Okay, yeah, let's go. How close does the South come to winning the war?
That's a matter of strong debate from a lot of people. But at Gettysburg, this is about as far as they got. This is for what's called the high watermark of the Confederacy, the high watermark of the rebellion. And they held this position I'd say about 20 or 30 minutes, and were repulsed. And so this was Longstreet's assault, commonly called Pickett's Charge. George Pickett had the immediate command. And these are some of the forces that were part of that on the southern side, as well as those on the Union that repelled them.
So when you say the high water mark, this is where the Union lines are. Pickett's Charge makes it all the way up here and even captures part of the Union line.
Overwhelms part of the artillery. There's a monument over there to Alonzo Cushing, who was an artillery lieutenant, who gave his life defending his position there. He was given the Medal of Honor actually 10 years ago, very posthumously.
But they're charging into these cannons that are firing directly at them.
Yeah, they're going over a mile of fire Yeah, it shattered Pickett's division. They didn't really have hope of reinforcement. The artillery that was supporting them beforehand, the bombardment, was low on ammunition. This was their shot. It was an interesting one for Lee to make, but it was the shot he decided to take, and it did not pan out for him. And that's to the benefit of the United States.
It's a lot of bloodshed, but
It's a lot of bloodshed.
so the prophecy says that the southern states will reach out to the nation of Great Britain.
The southern states very much reached out to Great Britain. They sent diplomats, they sent delegates, none of them officially received by the British, although they met with them unofficially. By this point in the war, Britain was not going to intervene on the Confederacy's side.
Well, was there a point where Britain ever was when they ever did?
They considered it very heavily at several points. The United States didn't help themselves. They caused a British ship, the Trent, to have to pull over, as we would say, and they boarded them and seized 2 Confederate diplomats. British was a neutral flag. The British were outraged by this, but cooler heads prevailed, and it didn't lead to war. That's one of the few points it could have, and indeed, right before Antietam, the British almost intervened. When we say intervened, they weren't planning on coming in with their own military and blowing the Union out of the water. They were planning on diplomatic negotiations, trying to get us to stop for humanitarian reasons. But that never happened. Not with Britain. France considered helping. They never really did. Russia was actually a Union ally. Nowhere did Confederacy find help from Europe.
Well, they reached out.
But they reached out and they tried very hard. And you did see British businessmen helping because they wanted to run the blockade. They wanted to make money. They built blockade runners. They sometimes contracted to help build ships that would be privateers for the Confederacy. But that was British businessmen. It wasn't the British government, and the government was very frustrated by what was going on there.
So there's 2 ways the prophecy could be fulfilled. It says, the southern states will call upon the nation of Great Britain, and they shall call upon other nations, meaning the southern states did call upon other nations besides Great Britain to intervene. But there's another way to interpret the prophecy, which is that Great Britain was going to call upon other nations. And then the prophecy says war will be poured out upon all nations.
And Britain, ironically in this case, did call on other nations because they decided they weren't going to act unilaterally. If they were going to appeal for the United States, they were going to do it with other nations to back them up, and nobody wanted to get together fully for that matter.
Oh, so that's one way it could have been.
One way it can be fulfilled. But yeah, you can look to it as a fulfillment when it comes to other wars.
Another part of the prophecy is that it says that after many days, slaves shall be marshaled to war and rise up against their masters.
Yes.
How is that fulfilled in the Civil War?
So starting with the Emancipation Proclamation, the United States started enlisting African-American troops, of which 180,000 would serve during the war. 40,000 of those would pass away, would die either in battle or from disease. That's 10% of all Union forces during the war, 180,000 African-American troops that enlisted during that time period.
And none fought here at Gettysburg, but other places.
Other places, very valiantly fought. African-American troops were not appreciated often by their commanding generals. There was a lot of stereotypes and ideas that were just incorrect, that they weren't brave, they would flee at the sight of hearing gunfire. But yeah, they fought valiantly.
So tell us about President Lincoln and his role in making Gettysburg what it is.
So President Lincoln was invited to give remarks, some short remarks, at the dedication of the battlefield cemetery here, which happened a few months after the battle, on November 19th, 1863. He wasn't the main attraction of the event. That was Edward Everett, who was the main orator there. He was a very famous speech giver for his day. And President Lincoln thought long and hard about the remarks he was going to give. He had a few drafts. We have several of them still today. He summed up the purpose of the war, why it was being fought. And it was for a new birth of freedom for the country. And Edward Everett said he would like to think he did as good a job summarizing it in a few hours as President Lincoln had in a few minutes.
Doctrine and Covenants section 87 talked about the Civil War, but also framed it in terms of a struggle to change the world from the way it was to prepare for the millennial kingdom of Christ. Part of the revelation itself talks about slaves rising up against their masters and being marshaled and prepared for war. And language not too far from that was used to turn the Battle of Gettysburg into a rallying cry that helped people understand the real reasons behind the war. A few months after the battle, a military cemetery was dedicated here, and Abraham Lincoln came and gave the famous talk now known as the Gettysburg Address. The Gettysburg Address was a really powerful instrument in reshaping the war, so it wasn't just about a squabble over federal powers and state powers, but a struggle over slavery. that Abraham Lincoln talked in the Gettysburg Address about this nation achieving a new birth of freedom under God. That he saw this nation as also God-blessed and overseen by God, but that some of the sins that we had engaged in, like the sin of slavery, would have to be expunged before we could become the people that we were meant to be. The Gettysburg Address and other similar notions transformed the Civil War from a war that was just about power to a war over individual rights, over individual freedoms. The type of war that, as terrible as war is, might be worth fighting so that everybody can have the same rights and privileges that we all deserve.
Jared, this is a great way to kind of use one battle to illustrate how awful the entire war was.
Yes.
But the prophecy is about wars. It says the wars that will commence with the rebellion of South Carolina. Should a member of the church feel a little scared that we live in the latter days, or hopeful?
There's fear over things that might happen, things that we can't control. But if we do what that prophecy encourages us to do, to stand in holy places and be not moved, to go to the temple and center that around our lives, then I think we will be blessed as we go forward with the various trials that we experience. That might be a personal one. That might be a broader one, such as a conflict.
Might be a rough ride, but there's things to look forward to.
Yeah.
And ways to be safe.
There are.
All right.
There are.
Well, thanks, Jared.
Thank you.
This has been really great.
Glad we could do it.
Yeah. I'm here at Utah Veterans Memorial Park and Cemetery in Bluffdale, Utah. And this is a site that's dedicated to honoring the veterans of wars fought by the United States. In fact, I have an uncle buried right over there who fought in the Korean War and was a member of the Utah National Guard for most of his life. Now, the prophecy on war in the Doctrine and Covenants unfortunately talks about the American Civil War being the beginning of the wars leading up to the Savior's second coming, not the end. And there may be some strife and contention that we have to live through before Jesus returns to the earth. But the prophecy does give us the assurance that if we stand in holy places and be not moved, we can find peace. We can strive to bring peace to earth, even if it might not fully come until Jesus returns. And most importantly, we can strive to have peace in our hearts, knowing that we have assurances through the gospel of Jesus Christ.